Sure.
Welcome and good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. My name is Steven Wijaya. I'm the Secretary General for Global Indonesia Professionals Association, or in short, GIPA. GIPA is a global association for Indonesian professionals and executives working overseas, and I personally am focusing on leading our secretariat, as well as on empowering our professionals hubs across G20, ASEAN, and other key markets. Today, we have a few wonderful speakers who have kindly made time to be joining us in our latest Global Connect series on unleashing financial stimulus against COVID-19. We will be having Tom Orlik, Global Chief Economist of Bloomberg, Lord Desai, Chairman of OMFIF, the official Monetary and Financial Institutions Forum, the think tank for central banking, economic policy, and public investment. And then our very own Christy Zacharias, GIPA's head of EMEA, who also works in Barclays as their investor relations. Whereas we will also be hearing keynote remarks from Febrio, who is the chairman of Fiscal Policy Agency at Indonesia's Finance Ministry, and as well as some closing remarks from Wenia Tan, the country head of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei at Bloomberg. Esteemed speakers, you're speaking to a live audience of around 450 individuals, most in Indonesia, United States, the UK, and the Europe, with viewers from as far as Australia, Canada, and Argentina. Today's session will be moderated by Steven Marcelino, the chairman of GIPA, who drives our strategic partnerships to promote business and investment links. He took up this role after co-founding the Indonesian Professionals Hub in the UK called GIPA UK. He was the executive director of GIPA UK between 2015 to 2020, and he also represented diaspora professionals at global forum conferences. Currently, Steven is ASEAN Capital Market Director at Accenture UK, a global management consulting firm. He promotes financial market developments across Southeast Asia, working with regulators to allow member states to draw more capital in accelerating infrastructure development. He also doubles down in facilitating inward investment from institutional investors and business leaders in Indonesia. And prior to Accenture, Steven worked in Prime Brokerage Division at UBS Investment Bank, London's office. Now, if you would like to submit any of your questions anytime during the session, please submit your questions through the Q&A box. If time permits, Steven Marcelino, our moderator, will call on you to ask these questions live with your video and audio. Therefore, when you are given a chance to ask questions live, please do turn off your video and unmute your audio. Now, without further ado, please allow me to welcome our moderator for the day and GIPA's chairman, Steven Marcelino.
Thank you, Steven Wijaya. It's our great pleasure to be joined over 450 professionals, executives, academicians, and government officials around the world. Last time I was told our attendees are from 100 cities and over of 35 countries around the world. So with that note, good evening, those of you in Indonesia and across Asia Pacific. Good afternoon if you are in Europe or Middle East, and you can see that still bright here in London. If you're with me in the UK, welcome as well as very good morning to those of you who are just waking up from both East Coast and West Coast of Americas. So it's great to be joined with many of you. Global Connect series today, really aiming to bring the latest global trends and insights from leading thought leaders to Indonesians back home, as well as Indonesians who work overseas. And in today's session, we are joined with fantastic speakers, and we're going to do a deep dive on our timely topic that we'll be discussing on unleashing financial stimulus against COVID-19. You probably have heard a lot in the media and mainstream media around all of the support, and we're really not talking just billions amount of dollar, but multi-trillion packages being announced around the world. So we're definitely going to hear from our speakers on that note. But before introducing and moving on to our discussion, I thought it would be good for me to just do a quick welcome and say a few words about GIPA. So special welcome to representatives from Indonesia's Minister of Foreign Affairs, and representatives from Indonesian embassies and consulate around the world. In particular, great support from the Indonesian Embassy London. Would like to welcome Bapak Adam Tugio, the interim head of mission, along with his senior staff at Functional Affairs and attaches at the embassy. Welcome to senior representatives from Indonesia's Ministry of Finance, as well as those colleagues in the Director General of Taxation and other institutions within MOF. Special welcome to Wenya Tan, and as well as her Bloomberg colleagues that are joining. Wenya will be doing a quick remarks towards the end. Welcome to representatives from partners of Indonesia Economic Diplomacy Partner, both Indonesia Investment Promotion Center at IIPC, as well as the Central Bank of Indonesia Overseas Rep Office. I could see from the list that we are joined by the directors level, both in London and New York, so it's great that you're able to join us, and over 25 other representatives from Indonesia's ministries and agencies that are joining our thriving professional community. So it's great to have all of you here. A little bit about GIPA, Global Indonesia Professional Association. We aim to promote business and investment links overseas through highly talented professionals and executives working in key industry groups across G20 and ASEAN. And GIPA is well positioned to be a true partner for Indonesia's economic diplomacy from the private sector. Over the past 6 months, we've been supporting professional leaders from across these markets to develop their own hubs so that they can build community of thriving professionals in their respective jurisdictions. So if some of you who work abroad and you're not yet connected to professional hubs, so please give us a shout out after the session, and we'd love to connect you with respective professional hubs in your jurisdictions. To that note, we can now move on to our long-awaited panel discussion, the star of the show that we'd like to hear. So as kind of the first speaker, I'd like to turn to Christy Zacharias, who is GIPA's head of EMEA region at GIPA, as well as she also works as in investor relations at Barclays. Christy, it'd be good for you to share a little bit of how do financial markets reacting to this global humanitarian crisis as it unfolds, as well as latest overview on fiscal responses that announced among advanced economies, emerging economies, as well as perhaps Indonesia. What's your thought?
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Maybe I would like just to give a few high-level observations around the impact and also the corresponding response that we've seen so far. I think it's not an understatement to say that the COVID-19's impact on financial markets, it has been shocking, it has been significant, and there will be detrimental implications for the long-term outlook to the global economy. And now, just a little bit of context setting, I think Stephen mentioned that professional members at GIPA come from all different sorts of industries. So just to give a little bit of context, I think in late February, we saw stock markets worldwide reporting the largest single week decline since the 2008 global financial crisis. And this is over outbreak fears that back then didn't seem that apparent. And then everything escalated in early March with unprecedented contraction in economic activity and collapse in oil demand, which led to substantial price shocks across the energy market. We saw oil price losing 70% of their value, dipping below $20 per barrel. And this ultimately resulted in an estimated 30% of global stock markets wiped out in a month. We saw volatility spikes back to crisis levels and a sharp widening of non-investment grade debt credit spreads. From an Indonesia lens, we experienced declines that are in line with the global market. The Indonesian financial market saw equity prices drop by around 30%, reaching a 40% decline at one point in March. And interestingly, the Indonesian rupiah suffered one of the largest currency depreciation across G20, and indeed the largest one in ASEAN, with 20% depreciation from January to March. And luckily, for those of us based in Indonesia, more than half of the March depreciation has reversed back. So year-to-date depreciation is currently at 8% against USD. But given this context, I think we saw from governments to central banks to international financial institutions and multilaterals across the board, there have been substantial downgrades in economic forecasts and significant debate around the shape of recovery. And I think we will hear more around this from Tom. But fortunately, the stimulus response to the financial shock has also been significant. And I think more importantly, relatively timely. So globally, governments across the world have deployed financial stimulus estimated at 4% of the global GDP to give a sense of like scale, compared to the 2008 global financial crisis, this is double the amount, and global debt now stands at around 30% of GDP. If Hilmi can move to the next slide, I have a couple of slides just to show kind of how countries have responded to this unprecedented crisis. In terms of advanced and emerging economies, a few high-level observation is that advanced markets, in advanced markets, more than 50% of the stimulus is directed towards supporting individuals at risk of being laid off. I think interestingly, over the past week, I've heard someone say that this is a crisis where we're trying to save lives, but we're also trying to save livelihoods. In contrast, in emerging economies, only circa 15% of the stimulus is directed towards individuals. And in advanced markets, there is minimal spending on public infrastructure investment. This is in contrast to what we saw in the global financial crisis in 2008, whereas $4 and $10 are spent on public infrastructure across emerging markets. So there are definitely clear differences in trends in terms of how they prioritize their spending. Additionally, in advanced markets, we saw targeted industry support and business loans at a combined 17%, whereas I think the focus across emerging markets has primarily been more on tax reliefs. Targeted industry support and business loans currently stands at circa 2%. Looking more specifically on the Indonesia lens, the stimulus mix for Indonesia, as you can see, is actually slightly more aligned to the advanced markets rather than emerging markets. So we saw that public investment in Indonesia is relatively minimal, whereas compared to other emerging nations, it's at 39%. And job retention scheme in Indonesia is also a lot more compared to the emerging markets average of around 5%. Hilmi, if you want to flick onto the second slide. Cool, thank you. And there's also just a couple of observations around Indonesia's stimulus response compared to countries across G20 and ASEAN. So there has been, I guess, less focus on direct cash payments relative to all countries, but I guess particularly relative to emerging markets, because interestingly, I think the cash is king kind of expression is arguably more applicable amongst emerging markets where wealth is distributed less evenly across countries, and some regions are less developed than others. Additionally, there has also been, in terms of Indonesia, less focus on business loans and grants relative to other countries. Personally, as someone who is working in banking and operationalizing the UK government's business loans and grants response, we have seen this working effectively in the UK. So maybe moving forward, it's something to consider, something to evaluate against. It's also quite prevalent amongst ASEAN countries. In terms of kind of the impact, as at yesterday, April indicators in the UK confirmed that these business loans and grants have led to lending to UK corporates increasing by circa 50 billion in the past 8 weeks. That's massive. And as a result, individual bankruptcy filings is down 10% month on month from the peak of the coronavirus impact. We saw averages of 40 individual bankruptcy filings a day. This is compared to pre-corona, pre-lockdown, that's around 60. Early stage corporate insolvencies is also down over 5% month on month. And we're currently averaging around 50 insolvencies a day compared to 55 to 60 pre-lockdown. So I guess it has, there are tangible impacts that we have seen from this. So I guess those are kind of initial high level observations that I would like to make.
Thank you, Christy. Very valuable insights. And I thought it would be good now if we could hear from Lord Desai. Lord Desai, he is the chairman of OMFIF. He is a member of UK House of Lords, and he's also Emeritus Professor at London School of Economics. Lord Desai, I mean, you've come across a number of crises in the past, yet this time is really unprecedented. The crisis is somewhat different. It would be good to get your perspective on this and when you see different crises and how emerging markets governments should really be doing in the next 6 to 8 months in terms of their policy responses.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me. I would say that the lucky thing about this crisis is that it is a complete black swan. It is nobody's fault. The banks didn't misbehave, the governments didn't misbehave. It is not a collapse of the stock market because of endogenous reasons. And it also signals, after 50 years since America left the dollar-gold link, that the whole specter of inflation, which had been haunting government fiscal and monetary policy can now be forgotten. We can do a variety of things very quickly, unlike in 2008, that can repair the system. Because COVID being a threat to lives and livelihoods, what we have to do, what countries have done, spend now, pay back later. And the markets are happy with that. So that is the first thing to say. Secondly, in this crisis, capital has not been destroyed. Activity has gone down, revenues have gone down, but skills have not been destroyed and capital has not been destroyed. So when we go back, that will be that much easier to restore output and profits. Thirdly, I would say that globally, while globalization of the old variety will break up, there would be a difference in how the regions behave. And my expectation is that all of Asia, especially East Asia, Southeast Asia, are going to really go into the front because they have been enjoying a manufacturing revolution for the last 50 years, the same period. And now if the domination of the developed countries is going to be lessened because they have not managed the crisis very well, I think we will see a redirection of trade and of economic power from the West to the East. Those are my main observations. And I think that no country has come out very well in terms of anticipating or dealing with COVID. Surprisingly, the Western countries have done worse than Asia and Africa. And that may also rebalance power, political power across the globe. So I think the 21st century is going to be a very different century than what we expected 20 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lord Desai. That's very interesting, and I certainly will come back to that point around the shifting from the West to East and how COVID-19, as per a number of crises in the past, has triggered changing in global infrastructure when it comes to governance and relevant things. So certainly very interesting points there. But I thought it would be good to also hear from Tom. Tom Orlik is the Global Chief Economist at Bloomberg. He was also previously Chief Economist for Asia at Wall Street Journal, based in Beijing. I thought it would be good to hear from you, Tom, around, what's your thoughts around looking ahead view and some of the outlook we're seeing globally, and perhaps what's happening in Asia, as there are a number of Asian countries that will first come out from this crisis. It would be interesting to hear your thoughts on that, and maybe if there is some downside risk associated with your projection and your outlook, that would be really good to hear.
Well, thanks very much, Stephen, and thank you to you and to GPA for setting up this event and inviting me to speak on this distinguished panel. I'm very honoured. My wife is also very honoured to have this opportunity to spend an additional 2 hours caring for our children on her own on a Saturday morning. So let me share a few thoughts. So firstly, let me talk about the global economic outlook. So we are now anticipating a 4% contraction in the global economy this year. That's down from our forecast of a 3% expansion before the virus hit. And it's considerably worse than the 0.1% contraction which the global economy experienced in 2009, which, as everyone knows, was the dark moment of the great financial crisis. So we're really looking at a catastrophic collapse in global output in 2020. And that 4% forecast is actually based on some somewhat optimistic assumptions. So things could easily be worse than that. Let me speak briefly about what those optimistic assumptions are. So the first optimistic assumption is that most countries will get their outbreaks under control in the second quarter of the year, and so growth can resume in the third quarter. Now, if we think about the experience in China, where they seem to have controlled the outbreak and industry has come back quite quickly, and we assume that that can be read in other countries, then it's plausible to think that growth can resume in the second half, but it's by no means guaranteed. Virus cases continue to rise in many major economies. It's also possible that it will seem like the world has the virus under control, lockdowns will ease, economic life will resume, and then we will see a resurgence of cases requiring a lockdown to come back into place in the second half of the year. The second somewhat optimistic assumption that we've made is that stimulus will be timely and adequate. So if we think about the lockdown and its economic impact, the lockdown is really hammering income for businesses and households. And so what's required for a recovery to start once the outbreak is under control is for governments to step in with massive compensation for businesses and households so that they are positioned to get back to work, to get back to consumption, to get back to investment once the virus is under control. Now, many countries have announced very, very large fiscal stimulus, but not everyone has, and not everyone is in a position to do enough. Even here in the United States, where the initial stimulus response was really big, we now see a risk that political fighting will prevent further increases in stimulus. So the second risk we'd highlight is stimulus will be a day late and a dollar short, and as a consequence, we have a scarring recession, which makes the recovery that much slower and growth for the year that much weaker. So our base case for the global economy, negative 4% growth for the year. It could be worse. If we get a second outbreak, if we have an inadequate stimulus response, negative 4% would start to look like an optimistic forecast. Let me speak briefly about Asia before handing back to the moderator. So a few points to make about what's happening in Asia. So the first is, and just to echo the point which Lord Desai made so eloquently, in many countries, the response to the outbreak in Asia appears to have been more timely and more effective than it has been in Europe or the United States. So China appears to have controlled its outbreak relatively quickly. South Korea appears to have effective policies in place. Hong Kong, Singapore seem to be doing this in a smart way. And what that means is that the lockdowns in those countries are going to be shorter and the economic impact is going to be smaller. So I think one important point for Asia is that we expect them in general, we expect Asian countries in general to come out of this a bit better than European countries or countries here in the US or in Latin America. Second point to make, which is less encouraging, Asia, of all the countries in the world, is the most exposed to problems in global trade. And there's an obvious issue there, which is, well, China and other countries have controlled their outbreaks, they're ready to go back to work, but with the Europeans and the Americans still under lockdown, export demand is disappearing. And Asia is highly exposed to that withering of global demand. I would add on the trade point that at the beginning of the year, we were all optimistic that the US-China trade war was over. Now, with the US and China playing a blame game over the virus, with the presidential election looming in November, we see US-China tensions rising again. So I would not rule out the possibility that the second half of the year brings higher trade tensions, and that becomes a problem for China and also more broadly for other Asian countries that feed into the Chinese supply chain. The last point I would make is that, of course, Asian countries are going to experience this shock in different ways. In general, countries that have a higher exposure to the services sector, and especially to tourism, are going to have more problems than others. And on that axis, Thailand stands out as a country which will probably face a bigger blow than some of its neighbours down in Southeast Asia. So with that, thank you for your attention, and let me hand back to the moderator.
Thanks, Tom. It's a very comprehensive forecast, the scenario forecast that you have, and it's rather bleak that the world economy will likely contract about 4%, and it could be worse with all of the sensible variables that you're observing. Certainly, policymakers should really be looking out for those variables. Perhaps before we turn to our keynote remarks from the chairman of Fiscal Policy Response Agency, Febrio Cacciaribu, I thought it would be good if I ask a few questions, and after the keynote remarks, we'll ask and invite questions from our audience. We've been hearing a number of new rounds of fiscal stimulus that will be announced in the US, Europe, Asia. Now, people are also wondering in the markets whether we will see potential another round of sovereign debt crisis that similarly followed the global financial crisis 2008, where Europe has a huge pile of sovereign debt crisis. Perhaps I'll turn to Lord Desai. Do we think emerging markets have this potential problem for potential debt crisis, and what they should be doing in order to mitigate such a thing? Because we see two different distinctive groups in emerging markets. You have the Argentina, with already pre-COVID a dire situations with their balance sheet, and other countries, and perhaps other emerging markets that are a lot more prudent, such as China. Perhaps I could also consider Indonesia, with just about 30% debt to GDP ratio in that front. But all of this debt to GDP ratio will move very quickly. Is there any basis for concerns here?
No, my view is that the debt GDP ratio was always the wrong thing to focus on, because you're comparing a stock with a flow. Debt is a stock, income is a flow. What you need to do, and now increasingly some treasuries are accepting it, you compare the debt servicing charge to the income flow. And as long as your nominal GNP is growing faster than your debt servicing bill, i.e. your growth rate of nominal GNP is greater than the interest rate you're paying, you are viable. Because, in a sense, right now, the urgency is to save lives and livelihoods. Debts can always be paid later. And I think the market will realize, and I doubt that the interest rates are going to rise very much in the near future. So I think for the time being, don't worry about it. Later on, you may have to sell assets and so on. But right now, save the present moment and worry about the future in the future.
Makes sense. Thanks, Lord Desai. That's also aligned with a conversation we had with the IMF MD, where Xi basically said, spend as much as you can, keep the receipt, pay back later. I think that's certainly interesting. Now, I thought it would be good also to hear from Tom and perhaps Christy as well around your thoughts, how some of these markets will, what sort of composition on the next rounds of fiscal stimulus. Obviously, Christy has presented quite beautifully a number of different mix of packages that governments around the world will be, that have announced. If we look ahead in the next 6 to 10 months, what sort of things that countries, say in the US, Europe, and Asia, will be focusing on? Would it be SMEs, business support, or would it be more the cash direct transfer, job retention scheme? It would be good to get your thoughts. Should we start with Christy, then Tom?
Yeah, I think I touched on this kind of earlier on as I presented the different stimulus mix, but I guess personally hoping to see more potentially direct cash transfers across emerging markets, particularly in Indonesia. Seeing kind of the support, direct support to individuals and businesses. I think earlier it was also mentioned that we do need to support people at the business level and at the individuals level directly. I mean, targeted industry support is good. Healthcare is obviously good to help support the economy, but at the end of the day, like especially in emerging markets, it's the peoples whose livelihoods are going to struggle and get impacted most from the crisis. So that's the outlook from my side.
Sure. Thanks, Christy.
Uh,
Tom?
So I want to echo the remarks by both Lord Desai and Christy. I think that the problem is going to be, the problem is not too much deficit spending now. The bigger problem is going to be if there's too little deficit spending now. Now, if you have a really big fiscal stimulus, if you borrow a lot of money, and that's a one-off, it doesn't really change debt dynamics. You have a one-off addition to the debt stock, doesn't really change the fundamental picture, even if it's a big one-off addition. What really damages the debt trajectory is a sustained period of a number of years of subpar growth and fiscal deficit sustained at a wide level over a number of years. So what we need to do, what governments around the world need to do, is just spend as much money as they can right now. And that money mainly has to be in the form of transfers to households to replace lost income. If that happens on a sufficient scale and the virus gets under control, then economies around the world are going to be positioned for a quick bounce back in the second half of the year. If that doesn't happen, then even when the virus is under control, we will have a protracted period of very, very weak growth. We'll have a protracted period of large fiscal deficits, and that's when you'd start to really worry about debt sustainability.
Fantastic. Thank you for this has been very helpful because we've already received a number of questions from the audience around some of the concerns around this debt and whether this could potentially be sustainable. But I think certainly with the right way of looking at it, with the current urgency today, certainly the current financial stimulus that have been announced are not enough, and we probably need more in order to move forward. So I think that's all makes sense. That's really helpful. I just want to double check to Stephen Wijaya. Do we have Pak Febrio Kacaribu from MOF has joined? Because I believe we'll be shortly hearing from him.
Febrio unfortunately is still in a meeting right now. He'll be joining later. Right.
Okay. No problem. That's fine. If that's the case, then we already actually received a number of questions from audience, and I thought it would be good if I call your name for the audience to be able to maybe turn on your video and unmute yourself, and perhaps if you can just quickly introduce yourself and then ask the questions, if that's okay. Firstly, we have Kevin Halim, Deloitte UK.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yep. Hi, my name is Kevin Halim. So I've just got a question actually two questions for the speakers of today. So just now we have talked about trying to encourage people to get back to work and also to encourage consumption, in order to support us to bring us back to growth. With regards to bringing people back to work, the Chancellor Rishi Sunak is trying to reduce the furlough scheme, in order to encourage people to get back to work. However, there are certain sectors, for example, tourism and hospitality industry, whereby they are probably not going to recover within the next 6 months or even up to a year. So with regards to that, are they going to remain unemployed, or are they going to be undergoing underemployment for these people? Because even though they might want to return to the jobs, they might not be able to because there is just no demand for global air travel, for example, or even demand for tourism and resorts. And with regards to consumption, there can be government spending, as we can see just now in the chart by Christy, whereby China is spending a lot on public infrastructure, or they could also be direct cash transfers that we have seen Japan is doing quite significantly. So with regards to that, I would just like to hear the speaker's thoughts on whether there is a better model of consumption, whether should government on the fiscal stimulus, should government be spending on public infrastructure, or whether they should just take all the cash and just inject it directly into the households. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Good question. Should we just take one more question from the audience, then I'll just go around to the speakers if that's okay. I believe Nabila Gunawan from Climate Bonds Initiative. Do we have Nabila on the line? I actually don't see Nabila here, but I've got the questions.
I think Nabila got dropped off.
Right, okay. If that's the case, then Early Abani from American Express, New York.
Hey, hello there.
Hey.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, can hear you, okay.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Early. I'm a risk manager at American Express here in New York. So my question, I think, would be just broadly for anybody who's, the speakers, if you could just maybe have some insights to what you think we would price risk going forward. So the reason why I'm asking this is I think yesterday the US, the House of Representatives just passed another stimulus package, right? Though it has to go to the Senate, there's, as you pointed out, there's so many stimulus packages going around the world that is ensuring that companies don't fail or maintain their operations during a crisis, right? So my concern would be, in the future, would we price credit risk or even investment risk differently, knowing that in the global crisis, expectations could be that your companies will be saved? So really, yeah, that's my question.
Thanks, Early. Good questions there, both there. Why don't I start with Lord Desai responding to Kevin's question around which sectors that require further stimulus and what sort of things that would look like. I thought it'd be good. And then we can get Tom to respond to Early's questions around the pricing risk going forward. I think that would be good.
I think the main thrust, both in Asia, perhaps more than even in the West, but everywhere, is to make sure that people do not suffer from a drastic loss of income, even for a short period of time. Companies are worth saving, but companies can go and be reformed. What's important is that people's lives are not so badly disrupted that they lose confidence, they lose skills, and they lose lives. So I think the first thing, because this crisis, unlike any other crisis, has made production impossible, even though the capital is not destroyed. And nobody is responsible for it. So the people who have been thrown out of jobs ought to be preserved so that the economy can go on. What we have learned from this crisis is that economy are people getting together and producing and consuming. It's nothing else. People have to get together to make the economy run. We have to preserve the people.
Thanks, Lord Desai. Cristiano, you just chat. Do you want to just quickly respond to Kevin's question?
Yeah, I think just picking up on your point around furlough scheme, I think recently it has been announced that it was extended to October 2020 for us. So I think that's good news, that showing the government is still there to support and they still have capacity to just continue supporting the economy. I think also around your question around the supply boom, I think potentially green stimulus can be an exciting avenue because there has been research around it. Like recently there was an Oxford study showing that government spending towards green projects have higher returns per GBP spent. So I think that can be, if we interweave solving this economic crisis with looking at the long-term implications for climate and starting green infrastructure projects, I think it can help absorb that supply boom for the medium term at least. So I think that's hopefully giving you a bit of perspective there.
Thanks, Christy. Do you just quickly elaborate on the UK furlough scheme? Because I think conscious people may not be as familiar with how UK's kind of fiscal response around the job retention scheme and the furlough scheme, Christy.
Yeah, sure. So the furlough scheme essentially is you're not fired, but you are basically on leave. You're not working for the company anymore. The government is paying 80% of your salary to a maximum of £2,500. And it is indefinite. There is no time frame. The companies, I believe, they don't have to give you kind of like, this is the day you come back, but essentially it's supporting, I think, around 15% of the workforce. The number might have increased since then, but it is a substantial amount of people.
Perfect. Thanks, Christy. And if I can turn to Tom to take a look at the pricing, the changing, the way we will price risk going forward. Earliest question.
Sure. So I'm delighted to take that question because the Bloomberg terminal does very many things, but one of the things that it does best is allow people to price risk. So my initial and perhaps slightly self-serving answer to your question is the correct way to price risk after the virus outbreak will be the same as the correct way to price risk before the virus outbreak, and that's to make sure you have a Bloomberg terminal on your desk. More seriously, or indeed building on that, so I spent 11 years in China, and one of the unique characteristics of the Chinese market is that the presence of the state in the market is really pronounced. And what that means is that people think about credit risk in a very different way, right? Of course, people are thinking about the fundamentals of how much a company has borrowed or how much a government has borrowed and what their stream of income is and what the things that might affect that stream of income might be. But they are also thinking about where the company or the local government sits in the kind of the hierarchy of priorities for policymakers. Is this a company or a local government that will get rescued if things go wrong? Or are they not that important? Are they out of favor with key decision makers? Could they be left to sort of hang out to dry if something goes wrong for them? Put crudely, I think that Chinese experience is now going to be more relevant on a global level, right? Because we're moving into a market where governments and central banks in one way or another are hugely consequential in providing a backstop for borrowers. And that means that investors need to think about that policy decision, right? Who is going to get central bank support? Who is going to get government support? Who isn't? When is that government support or that central bank support going to be managed down? So I think it's going to be more complicated, and investors are going to be wanting to think about all of the old balance sheet factors that they have so much experience thinking about, but also that wider set of policy variables.
Sure. Thanks, Tom. Certainly is a good promotion there for Bloomberg Terminal. I'm sure when Tan will be able to talk a little bit more about that later on. But certainly it's we're living in a never normal world, I suppose. So I think it's interesting that that there will be certainly big change the way we price risk going forward. Helpful insights. I believe we're also joined by Pak Febrio Kacaribu. He's the chairman of the Fiscal Policy Agency at the Indonesia's Minister of Finance. Welcome, Pak Febrio, and it would be really good to hear Pak Febrio's keynote remarks in a bit, but because Pak Febrio just joined, I just want to give him a bit of time just to ensure he's set up nicely. Certainly we can see you, Pak Febrio. Welcome.
Hi, everybody.
Great, Pak Febrio.
I'm all set up, so
fantastic.
Yep.
And our speakers shared their perspectives from Christy Zacharias around how financial markets reacting so far on this global humanitarian crisis and the overview of fiscal policies There has been fiscal responses that have been announced by advanced economies, emerging economies, and also Indonesia. We've heard also from Lord Desai how this crisis is somewhat different from the past crisis in the past. We also heard from Tom Morley from Bloomberg on the global growth outlook and some of the downside risk that Bloomberg is closely monitoring on. So with that note, with a very very short and brief summary that may not do justice with a very engaging conversation we've had, I thought it would be good to hear from you, Pak Febrio, from MOF perspective on how do you see Indonesia's growth outlook this year, 2020 and 2021? And with the first round of fiscal response being announced, what sort of composition of the next rounds of fiscal stimulus may look like for Indonesia case?
Okay.
Pak Febrio.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Good evening from Jakarta, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank Global Indonesia Professionals Association for inviting the Indonesian Ministry of Finance to join this event. I would also extend my appreciation for GIPA, Bloomberg Center, and Indonesian Embassy in London for hosting this event. It indeed is a timely topic, not only for Indonesia, but also for the rest of the world. Governments all around the world have been at the stage that requires us to stay relevant as situations have been increasingly dynamic. Before I began, sharing with you our views on Indonesia's economic prospect in the middle of COVID-19 crisis, as well as government policy responses and plan, I would like to once again remind us all about what we have been facing in the past months. I believe we all agree that COVID-19 is an extraordinary event for the whole world. It is not like any other pandemics. It spreads very quickly with striking number of death rate everywhere and push authorities to act very responsively. We agree that unusual policy responses have significantly affected many aspects of our life, including social, economic, and financial. Indonesia's economic and financial conditions are not exception. We have seen a significant impact in economic activity across sectors, as well as consumption declining. Even in the early days of the virus outbreak, when it was still concentrated in China, it already provided challenges to us, as China is one of our largest major economic partners. However, when the virus spread to the rest of the world, including Indonesia, things get even more serious. Policy responses that we have undertaken, the so-called large-scale social distancing, have been obviously affecting the domestic economy. In the first quarter 2020, our GDP could only grow by 2.97% year on year. This is below our expectation and much lower compared to the same period last year, when we could maintain growth above 5% on average. It underlines how deep the impact of COVID-19, and I have to say that we haven't seen the bottom of it yet. That was still the first quarter. So it underlines how deep the impact of COVID-19 was to both demand and supply sides of the economy. Many strategic sectors are heavily affected: trade, food and beverages, hospitality, transportation, and manufacturing, among others. Considering the current development and risks that remain, we are expecting the economic growth in 2020 to be in the range of minus 0.4% to 2.3%. Of course, the government will always update its projection with new data incoming, new methods, or even developments. From what we have calibrated so far, the worst scenario will be minus 0.4%. The government have designed several economic policy responses, including the so-called National Economic Recovery Program. Besides maintaining economic growth, the program objectives is also to protect people's livelihood and well-being. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite you to recall what economic policy responses Indonesia have been implementing to date. These are what I would call extraordinary and unprecedented policies. The policies have been focusing on three aspects. The first one is protecting health and lives. That's the first one. The second one is managing purchasing power of people, particularly the poor and the vulnerable groups. The third supporting business sectors and helping them to survive and avoid further impacts such as bankruptcy and insolvency, especially in the financial sectors. Together with the central bank and other authorities, we have used an integrated policy mix to help creating buffer to avoid deep economic downturn. On the fiscal side, we have done refocusing and reallocation measures to create larger fiscal space so the budget can better support the health program, especially related to COVID-19 handling. Besides spending reallocation, we also have launched 3 stimulus packages of around 436 trillion rupiah, that is around 2.5% of GDP of Indonesia. With these programs in place, we are taking into account the downside impact of the pandemic to our revenue. We expect fiscal deficit to widen up to beyond 5% of GDP. It is going to be the first time for Indonesia to have fiscal deficit above 3% fiscal rule. Remember, we have a 3% fiscal rule in our law. In this regard, the government and parliament have already agreed on the enactment of government regulation in lieu of law, Perpu, in order to allow the fiscal deficit to increase. The issuance of Perpu was basically based on the understanding that there is an urgency for the government to quickly take extraordinary unprecedented measures to combat COVID-19 and mitigate the impact to the economy. With this strong legal basis and regulation in place, Indonesia's government will continue to take necessary actions to save the economy and maintain financial stability from this pandemic effect. This regulation covered not only the fiscal rule relaxation until 2022, but also enabling the government and authorities to strengthen their roles in maintaining financial sector stability. This includes the role of Bank of Indonesia to buy long-term government bonds in the primary market when needed. In the recently commenced 3rd fiscal stimulus that Indonesian government is looking into implementing soon is focusing on 3 areas. First, health, including support for the people's health insurance, increasing incentives for health workers, as well as spending for health facilities, such as also a rapid test. Second, strengthening social safety net through additional food subsidies, unemployment benefit. This is actually a new one. Unemployment benefit, we consider that a best practice in advanced economies, but we just introduced this year. We call it Kartu Prakerja. So this is the new unemployment benefit program for Indonesian unemployed people. Electricity subsidies and conditional cash transfers for poor and vulnerable households. These are basically expanding the existing programs that have been done in the last several years. And third, support for business sectors. In terms of supporting the business sectors, the government of Indonesia has established a program called National Economic Recovery, Pemulihan Ekonomi Nasional, to help the SMEs, state-owned enterprises, and affected firms to survive during COVID-19 pandemic and help them in the recovery period. For SMEs, the support include interest payment subsidy. So this is going to be launched in several days, hopefully on Monday. So this new program called interest payment subsidy for SMEs. Tax incentives and guarantee for new working capital. So this is a guarantee scheme for pushing more of working capital credit whenever there is potential maybe in the 3rd quarter or the 4th quarter of this year. Meanwhile, for SOEs, state-owned enterprises, the support include capital injection, compensation payment, as well as investment for working capital. Last but not least, government is going to provide various tax incentives again and government fund placement in banking sectors to support SMEs debt restructuring. In conducting this program, we will make sure the principles of fairness, people well-being, transparency, accountability, prudence, no moral hazard, and cost sharing are kept. For this program to run, we are currently preparing to complete the implementation strategy and regulations, especially National Economic Recovery Program. Some of the program details, such as sizes, the magnitudes, are still being discussed and formulated. Hopefully, very soon we're going to be able to announce this maybe as early as Monday. The main objectives of this program, I will reiterate again, is to help business sectors recover. and to restore the economy when the pandemic is over. Clearly, we have to come up with scenarios, even though we are facing uncertainty, clearly, but we have to have some scenarios to refer to. So at this moment, we are having a scenario that second quarter will be the deepest hit to our economy. Third quarter is going to be, might be less than second quarter, but fourth quarter, we hope recovery should be able to start. The government will keep assessing and evaluating the economic condition during pandemic and elaborate it to our projection. Extensively, we will also keep vigilant with the current dynamics and continue to remain anticipative and provide necessary responses. These are not good times. These are not easy times, clearly, but we have to have plans. That is all from me. I will be happy to elaborate more. So you have any questions? Thank you.
Sure, thank you, Pak Febrio, for a very comprehensive outlines on Indonesia's perspective. And I wish all the best for the upcoming days when the national economic recovery plans are being enforced, and certainly looking forward to further details on the sizes and the magnitude on this stimulus. We've got actually a few more questions from the audience. I'd like to call Javier Patria, a data scientist at RBS UK. You on the line already?
Hi, Stephen. Yes. Are you able to hear me properly?
Yes, we can hear you.
Cool.
You can go.
I think my question for Febrio has been answered through his initial speech, but I think I'd like for him to explore more on the differences between how SMEs are getting impacted as opposed to Indonesian listed corporates, because obviously there's the ability to weather the storm for cash constraints and liquidity constraint is different. So could you explore that differences?
Sure. And I think we'll also get a second question, but C has trouble tuning in. So question from Nabila Gunawan, who's currently in Indonesia, who works for Climate Bonds Initiative. Her question is, how can we use the fiscal response to COVID-19 as an opportunity to tackle climate change, and what are the options on the table the government should consider? So perhaps my suggestion, if Pak Febrio can take the question from Javier, based in the UK, around some of the details, how the government supporting the micro and the SME side, and maybe I'll tap into kind of Christy and Tom Orlick around kind of sort of the climate change questions, if that's okay. And later on, Lord Desai, if you can kind of comment generally in those two questions, that would be great.
Should I start?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Javier. SMEs and corporate Indonesia is clearly, they are very different. We are, well, GDP per capita Indonesia now is around 4,000 US dollars, but the inequality is very big. Especially when you talk about business sectors, there's a big gap between corporate world with SMEs in Indonesia. What we're trying to do is we realize the size, the magnitude, especially from the labor market perspective. More than 90% of our laborers are actually in working in the SMEs. So clearly, if we want to see who are the most vulnerable in terms of business sectors, clearly these are the SMEs. And tackling the SMEs will actually give big boost to majority of the people directly. So this is clearly one of the big considerations why we start. And obviously that's how you're supposed to start when you try to save your economy. You look at the most vulnerable segment of your economy. And clearly in terms of, well, actually let me start before going to the business sectors. Remember I told you guys about the social safety net expansion. The social safety net expansion is reaching out to families mostly. So these are in terms of cash transfers. And what we're trying to do is, of course, to manage, to maintain the purchasing power, not to drop too far. Now, what we have done is the expansion of the social safety net in the last 1 month, and this is going to last hopefully till the end of the year. And this is covering at least the bottom 40% of the poorest in Indonesia. So this is the bottom 40% of the social economic status of Indonesia population. And some of the programs actually, like unemployment benefits, actually covering a little bit up to the 5th decile of our population in terms of social status, social economic status. Now, so that's being done and that's been going on. Now, the next step is to look at into the business sectors. Now, when you try to start something in the business sectors, what's the first strategy is to start tackling these SMEs. And what we have done so far is the first step that we're going to do is this interest payment subsidy for ultra micro. So start from very small debitors with loans average 1 to 3 million rupiah. So that's why we call them ultra micro. Up to SMEs with 10 billion rupiah debt limit. So that's how we describe these SMEs segment that we want to help with this interest payment subsidy. So we will be giving them subsidy by paying directly their interest payment to the financial institutions they are borrowing from. So in total, this is going to be around 35 trillion rupiah to start maybe sometime next week. This program should be able to start rolling. So after that, we look at, the next step is looking at the SOEs. So going into the corporate, the first step we're gonna see is are there strategic SOEs that we need to also help? Clearly, Pertamina, PLN, those are SOEs that are getting tasked by the government to provide electricity, subsidized electricity, and also subsidized fuel. So those are clearly the strategic SOEs that we need to help. And also several others SOEs. Now, third step will be if we see that we need to also help further is the corporate world beyond that SOEs. But until now, we are still trying to formulate what moves, what kind of packages we are actually able feasibly do in the next, let's say 1 or 2 or 3 months for the corporate world. But for now, our focus is still at the SME side. That's for me.
Thanks, Pak Febrio. Could I turn to Christian Tom around the climate change question from Nabila, Climate Bonds Initiative, around some of the options that government should be considering? And I know, Christy, you mentioned very briefly on green stimulus. Do you want to just perhaps touch on that?
Yeah, sure, of course. So I guess the question around kind of balancing short-term economic recovery, but also long-term climate ambition, I think green stimulus here provides a key upside. And it's no better time to advocate for green stimulus than now, because we have seen firsthand the impact of something that's nature-driven, something that's kind of out of our control, and it's showing that climate risk is actually a significant risk to countries and to the world in general. And I think back in 2011, the World Bank did a study comparing green stimulus projects against traditional stimulus, drawing upon the financial crisis back then. And we've seen evidence that it creates more jobs. It's higher short-term returns, as I mentioned previously, and also there's also long-term cost savings opportunities. And I think at the moment in the US, the congressional Democrats, they're trying to push for this idea that companies receiving federal funding support from the stimulus needs to commit to reducing their carbon emission by 50%. This is just maybe one of the ways we can help companies to kind of think about their long-term climate strategy through fiscal stimulus. And additionally, I think in terms of the UK, I've heard talks around bailouts and loans going to at least fossil fuel companies or oil and gas companies. They're saying it has to have conditions attached to it. They have to make a commitment that would require them to reduce their exposure. So I think these are one of the ways, because I think for climate change, for significant actions to happen, individuals can advocate for it bottom up. We can create advocacy and around it. But at the same time, there is a top to bottom opportunity where you can get these big corporates to take tangible actions right now. And I think also from an investors and market perspective, they understand that it is important that I think ESG interests would actually be accelerated on the back of COVID-19. So essentially it is kind of, the time is now, yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Christian. I know you've been dealing with a lot of investors who cares about ESG interests, so certainly it would be something that Indonesia perhaps also should consider around kind of the mix of fiscal packages going forward, whether Indonesia should eventually consider some green stimulus going forward. Tom, what was your thoughts on this?
So as I remember from my time in China, policymakers were always very keen on saying, 危机也是机会. A crisis is also an opportunity. And whenever there's a crisis and there's a need for massive government intervention, there's an opportunity to do some positive things, right? And we see some positive things happening. Christy mentioned some of them. In France, the government is providing a bailout for the airline on condition that they stop domestic flights. Right, so here's some money to stop you going bankrupt. Please stop causing so much damage to the environment. And that's a model which I think we're going to see being used in different places around the world in different ways. At the same time, I'm not actually convinced that we're going to see a big step change in terms of environmental sustainability as a result of this crisis for a couple of reasons. So the first one is we're really in a very, very deep hole right now, and there's a very, very urgent need for stimulus. And this isn't really a moment to be too complicated or too fancy, right? This is a moment just to get a lot of money to the businesses and households who need it to prevent an even deeper collapse in the economy. So trying to be too clever in terms of adding environmental or other sort of caveats to stimulus right now would risk making the problem worse. The time for doing the sort of the clever environmental sort of conditions is really going to be in a few months' time, once we're through the sort of the first intensity of the crisis and we're thinking about how to bring demand back. Second reason I'm slightly nervous about the scope to make progress on environmental sustainability is that we've just seen a historic collapse in oil prices, right? And so government policy, of course, is important, but what's really important is the relative prices of fossil fuels and sustainable energy. And if fossil fuels now become incredibly cheap, then they're going to be used more, and that is going to be a challenge for the sustainability agenda going forward. So I'd love to see more progress in this area. There are some positive signs, but there are some things that make me a bit cautious about saying we're going to see very, very significant progress in this direction. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. And if I can turn to Lord Desai, to perhaps share your comments around what's really the right policies to really support SMEs in Asia. And I know you've done a lot of observing markets in Southeast Asia and South Asia around how governments around that part of the world really provide support to SMEs. You're probably on mute. Don't think we do we still have Lord Desai?
It's still there, but I think he has some connection issues.
Okay, well, Lourdes, let us know if you're if you can unmute yourself. But I think we probably conscious of time. We have 10 more minutes for Q&A, and then we'll move to the next one. But I think we've been getting a lot of questions, and we probably won't be able to go through the whole questions, but we'll probably come back to you after the session. We have interesting questions from Turkey here. If Chalim Darmawan is on the line from Indonesia Turkey Trade Agency. If Chalim Darmawan is on the line. I'll also invite Alex Ang, if you're on the line.
Hi, this is Alex. Do I go ahead?
Yes, Alex. Can you just introduce yourself quickly and then your questions?
Hi, yeah, I'm Alex from actually from Singapore. Thanks to the panel for the sharing. My question is, we see a lot of the government spending a lot of money and the equity markets still remain quite elevated. To what extent do we think that, government, the large government spending has actually advantaged the rich, who tends to be equity owners who have, not really suffered a capital loss at the expense of, the working class individuals, especially the millennials, who have to sort of bear the brunt in future with higher taxation, financial regression, and potentially also social tension. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Should we go to Pak Febrio first, and then we go to Tom and then Christy to respond?
Sure. For developing economy, emerging economy like Indonesia, it is clearly a by choice. The government really have to choose to spend more money on programs that impacting more of the population. So clearly that's the biggest understanding and consideration why we decide as our first step, if we going to help the business sectors, that's going to be the SMEs. So that's just clearly so obvious for us as we have very limited amount of money to spend to begin with anyway. So we have to really choose what is the biggest impact program that could actually help the biggest number of population. Now, as you might be aware as well, Indonesia is a very young population. We call ourselves in a period of demographic bonus, where our dependency rate is accordingly. So we are clearly helping the majority of the population, and clearly at the same time also helping our younger population, younger generation to be in terms of what's so-called the potential GDP aspect of it. We want our younger population to still have potential. So we want them to keep working. We want them to have good spending power, so they won't be affected too much in this current situation. Middle class, comparatively, they can help themselves better, especially if you realize that we are now in a working from home situation everywhere, especially in the big cities, Jakarta, Surabaya, Medan, etc. The middle class can actually help themselves. We have the luxury of ordering food online, but the SMEs, the people who are working in informal sectors, they are really struggling. So clearly the government make decision to really focus more on the most vulnerable group of the population. Back to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Tom?
Sure. Thanks, Stephen. So that's a great question. And of course, it's a question which also came up a lot in the context of the policy response to the great financial crisis. And the short answer is we need both, right? We don't want financial markets to collapse, because finance is the lifeblood of the economy. And if financial markets collapse, then this is going to go from a short, sharp recession into something which is much longer and more painful. So you do need central banks providing that backstop. You do need central bank asset purchases. You do need central bank liquidity injections. At the same time, as Febrio eloquently puts it in the case of Indonesia, this is a crisis which is having its worst impact on some of the most vulnerable members of society, right? People who work in the informal sector, relatively low-paid workers in the services sector. And so you also need governments to aggressively step in and compensate those people for their lost income. Now, the trouble is that central banks, because they are independent and because they can essentially create money with the push of a button, can move very, very quickly to support the financial sector. So that part of stimulus typically happens really quickly on a large scale and very effectively. And we see that today, right? The Fed, the ECB, the People's Bank of China, the Bank of Japan, in various ways have stepped in quickly and effectively and put a floor under financial assets. Now, the other part of it, the part which requires transfers to low-income families and individuals, now that requires action by legislatures, by the US Congress, by the British House of Commons, and so on. And that is a process which has more friction in it, right? There are conflicting views, there are political realities. So that happens more slowly, it happens in some ways less efficiently. And that, I think, is a problem today. But more generally, that's a structural problem with how we do policy. And it's something which I hope we're talking about the possibility that this crisis could spark a step change in terms of environmental sustainability. I think another area where we need a step change in policy effectiveness is trying to bring the effectiveness of those income support policies up so we don't have crises which have a big disproportionate negative effect on the most vulnerable members of society. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. Christy?
Yeah, I think just to, I think Tom brought up all the essential points there. And I think for Indonesia's case specifically, I think it is a structural struggle because we have a central government and the money needs to flow through different parts of the country, different parts of governments and provinces. So I think it will be a challenge there. I think just taking from what the UK has done, what I've seen work quite well in terms of supporting people who have lost their income is that the commercial banks in the UK, they've suspended dividends to support stabilization measures as well. So they've done payment holidays across mortgages, across personal loans, across credit cards. And at the same time, in the UK, we're also operationalizing 3 different types of support for businesses. So we have the business loans to SMEs, to larger businesses, but we also have bounce back loans, which are even for smaller businesses. So I think this kind of multi-pronged approach, we've seen it working well. We've seen it permeate societies quite efficiently. And I think different to the 2008 financial crisis, I think commercial banks are there to help step and support the economy as well. And I'm not saying this because I work for a bank, but I think there is a lot of capital buffers that they've built up through stress testing. And also central banks are also lowering their requirements for these banks for their ratios. And the Bank of England are no longer running their annual cyclical stress test scenarios. So I think there is scope for the commercial sector to support people on an individual and business by business basis.
Thanks, Christy. And thanks, Alex, for a very good questions there. So Alex, I'm from Singapore BCG. Right, so I believe Chalim Darmawan is already on. You can ask your questions, and then we'll go into comment on the questions that were raised by Bruce Lee, Kombujet from LA, so the comment from Chris Wong from EY UK as well. But Chalim, over to you first, please.
Okay, can you hear me well now?
Yes.
Okay, so my question's gonna be, after this economic crisis that we are facing, we will be facing a borderization, probably second wave of COVID-19, and also the climate change is still there. So we will still have a lot of problems in the world. But me, oh, by the way, I'm from Indonesia, Turkey. trade agency. So as entrepreneur, how can state activate entrepreneurship to get out the economic crisis faster, obviously, after this pandemic? What economic policy, and what I mean by economic policy is what instruments of budgetary, fiscal, and or monetary policy should be additionally introduced to stimulate economic growth?
Sure, thank you, Halim. Questions around fostering entrepreneurship in a post-pandemic. That's an interesting one. And then we have questions here from the chat, essentially talking about furlough scheme and job retention scheme. In certain advanced economies, government actually trying to protect employees for being laid off. They are covering quite a high percentage of their salary. In the UK case is 80%. In France, they're also covering an X percentage of their monthly salary until considerable period. It was still about May, and then it's already being extended towards autumn time. Perhaps is this the type of retention scheme that Indonesia should also consider to try protecting employees and professionals in certain key industries to ensure they're not being laid off, to avoid unemployment with a considerable price tag, obviously. Obviously, this also has been also one of the popular fiscal response in advanced economies, but at the same time comes with rather expensive burden to the fiscal budget. Now, on the entrepreneurship, why don't I go to Christy and Tom, and if Fabio can kind of speak to the latter questions around the furlough schemes that's being announced by a number of advanced economies. Is this a model that Indonesia may consider in the foreseeable future? Over to you, Christy.
Cool. Okay. I think in terms of fostering entrepreneurship, that's a good question, and I can't say I have all the answers. I think what I've seen so far is that the level of support, talking about the UK context, I think the level of support we give to entrepreneurs who hasn't even done like a Series A or a Series B raise, it's really micro, really small businesses, is that we've extended loans that is backed by the government. So if they default, then it's safe for the bank. So that's why they can aggressively lend more. I think that kind of government support in terms of backing the loans could help to make sure that entrepreneurs are more protected with their businesses. Yeah. Is Stephen?
Okay. Shall I jump in, Stephen, briefly?
Yes. Sorry, I was on mute.
Thanks, Stephen. So look, I think unfortunately this is going to bring us back to the Matthew principle, that famous verse from the Bible: "To them that hath shall be given, and to them that hath not shall be taken away." So who is resilient in a crisis? It is big companies with adequate reserves, with capacity to diversify, with capacity to provide their staff with the ability to work from home for an extended period, for example. And who is vulnerable in a crisis? Well, it's small businesses that don't have the cash on hand to see them through a period of weak revenue, that can't invest in the infrastructure which is required for resilience, that have difficulty rapidly shifting to a work from home arrangement. So I think this is a crisis that is going to be, it's not going to be good for anybody, but it's going to be big companies that come out of it marginally better, or relatively better relative to small companies. And so I think that, just to come back to the question, just underscores the need for governments to go that extra mile in providing some of the support for SMEs that they so desperately require.
Thanks, Tom. Fabio, if you would like to comment on the entrepreneurship things and
Yes.
side, and what sort of economic policies that may be able to support that, would very much welcome.
Yes.
And also around the furlough job retention scheme as well, if that's all right.
Okay. After the crisis, whenever it's going to be, in our scenario, that's hopefully fourth quarter, the economy will actually, we believe that the economy will actually be different in terms of the structure. We believe there will be a structural change in our economy. Clearly during the pandemic, a lot of sectors who can actually work from home, for example, can actually perform quite well. But those who are not privileged to have capacity to do that, clearly those are the most vulnerable group of people. But we see also that the entrepreneurial efforts have been different during this pandemic. People have found different opportunities, even though we have a very hard condition that we are facing right now. So we are indeed, as a government, in terms of thinking about policies of how to boost more of economic growth in the future, need to take into account the change of the economic structure after the crisis. Not to mention that we have younger population who are going to be still dominating the labor force. These are different characteristic of laborers. They also demand different characteristic of goods and services. So after the pandemic, during the pandemic itself, we actually come to realization that this is usually the best time for thinking about reforms. Now, the reforms that we are thinking at this moment, clearly, we are still facing a lot of pressures in thinking about policies to deal with the crisis right now. But at the same time, we're trying to push ourselves as well as government to think about reforms, because crisis is usually the best time for you to think about reforms. And because bad times will reveal themselves during crisis. So now you see, for example, health sector is revealing themselves as one of the most unsophisticated part of our economy. So clearly, this particular sector will need to be revamped and kept increase in terms of the productivity in the next several years. Clearly, if we want to invest in our economy, we clearly realize that health sector is one of the biggest sector that we have to invest in. Because now we're also having some problem with our social security system, BPJS, with and healthcare, universal healthcare system. So the financing of this healthcare itself, the investment more into the healthcare sectors, that's clearly going to be the focus of the next several years. Also, on top of that, we're also thinking about, there are several reform scenarios that we're thinking about. That's one of them. But to continue on that reform thought, we also need to think about the change to our tax base. Indonesia is one of the lowest tax ratios economy in the world. Before the crisis, we barely reached 10% of GDP in terms of tax revenue. And this is clearly not a healthy tax base or revenue generating system. So we need to think about reforms, and in the connection with that structural change in economy and labor market change in economy, we also need to anticipate how the structural change in economy will actually change the tax base in Indonesia. And we need to really think about that deeply of how to come up with different ways of collecting taxes or different ways of formulating tax policies in the future. So a lot of things are going to change after the crisis, hopefully not too long from now. Employment, clearly, we mentioned about the unemployment benefit that recently just introduced. This is still our first experiment, clearly, but we come up with some number targeting about 5.3 million people unemployed to be covered by this unemployment benefit. This is clearly can be extended, it can be expanded if need be. But for now, the current system is giving majority of the money is actually going to be in terms of cash transfer like. But about 30% of the money will be going to paying for providing online trainings for these unemployed, recently unemployed workers. So at the same time, we're providing cash transfer, trying to help them with maintaining the stability of their at least subsistence level of consumption. At the same time, we also want them, when they are staying at home, why not trying to improve your potential, hence after the crisis, you at least come up with a better footing of recovering yourself as an individual in the labor market. Back to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Dr. Priyo. That marks almost the end of our Q&A session. Actually, it's been very engaging, and we still have a lot of inputs from professionals and executives working across G20 and ASEAN. Sorry we couldn't go through all of the questions, but I thought it's been certainly very engaging, and I'm keen for us to, conscious of time, move swiftly to Wenya for some closing remarks. That's okay, Wenya?
Sure, thank you very much. So a very good morning, afternoon and evening to all participants today. Firstly, I do apologize if I appear to be in a daze, as it is 11 p.m. here in Singapore. So good to know that there's a fellow Singaporean on the line as well. So firstly, a quick introduction. I head up our Indonesia business at Bloomberg, and it is with great pleasure for me to be invited by Stephen to close today's Global Connect series hosted by GIPA. Just to share a couple of background and insights into Bloomberg's relationship with the Indonesian Professionals Association. It kind of started when Stephen was heading up IPA way back in 2017. And since then, Bloomberg had the opportunity to host IPA's annual Indonesia Economic Outlook at the Bloomberg London office. Back then, we had hosted senior delegates like the Indonesian Finance Minister, Ibu Sri Mulyani. In 2018, we also worked together with the aim to strengthen Indonesia's attractiveness to global investors, and we hosted an executive roundtable to mark the inclusion of Indonesian rupiah-denominated debt into the Bloomberg Barclays Global Aggregate Index. So our partnership with the Indonesian Professionals Association have definitely gone a long way back. And today's participation in the Global Connect series via Zoom is probably unprecedented. It's quite amazing to see how technology can bridge and connect executives around the globe to discuss all these ideas and initiatives as we work together to navigate this economic uncertainty amidst COVID-19. So for us, me especially, Indonesia remains to be an important market for Bloomberg. It is one of the fastest growing economy across ASEAN, and huge investments are being made within Bloomberg to support this growth. And Indonesia have always been an attractive investment destination, and we see this in the foreign debt ownership. There was an article, just to share, written by Bloomberg News just a few days ago, and it was reported that sovereign bond sales totaled more than 15 billion, and that was 3 times that of 2019. And this is definitely the first step of confidence in Indonesia's fiscal regime to combat impacts of COVID-19. Earlier, there were some comments on the climate change initiative. And in the field of capital market infrastructure, sustainable cities, government innovations, and other aspects related to Indonesia's sustainable development goals, Bloomberg continues to support Indonesia's initiatives via a MOU that was signed last year, 2019, between PTSMI and Bloomberg Philanthropies. This event was witnessed by Michael Bloomberg and Sri Mulyani. There have been a lot of interesting insights, I would say, from today's session around the impacts of COVID-19 and the growth outlook for Indonesia. So I hope you guys all had takeaways. For me, definitely, there were good takeaways that I got from today's session. Just to share as well, coincidentally, Bloomberg also conducted a webinar yesterday discussing the COVID impacts and outlook on Indonesia's economy, on the FX, banking, and the nickel industry. So it's few takeaways from our poll results. There were approximately about 85% of participants. They expect further stimulus to be announced to help support the economy. 56% of the participants were bullish and they expect a market rebound in the second half of the year. And we also talked about China, whereby China is one of the largest trade partners for Indonesia, and 74% of the participants believe that China's ongoing recovery will have a positive ripple effect on Indonesia's economy in the next few quarters. So positive, sentiments there from the audience that we got from yesterday's event. We will have a replay of the webinar, and I've actually arranged with Stephen to have all the participants in today's series to be sent the link to the replay. So do watch the link if you guys are interested. So and lastly, just to close, it's with great pleasure for me to be representing Bloomberg today as head of Bloomberg Indonesia. And again, a big thank you to all the insights that have been shared by our speakers, and again, Geepa, for extending this invitation. And with that, good night to those in Asia, and have a good day ahead to those in London and New York. Thank you.
Thank you, Wenya. With this very eloquent remarks, certainly from a Geepa perspective, we look forward for further collaboration with institutions like yourself. And from Geepa perspective, we would certainly welcome participation and inputs from everyone's on the line who are keen to really promote the whole positive Indonesia story that align with our aim. So we certainly look forward for further collaborations with our external partners. We certainly will share the replay recording both for today's session of Global Connect series as well as the Indonesia Economic Outlook piece that Bloomberg hosted yesterday. With that note, I thought it would be also a good opportunity for us to promote the upcoming next month's session, another Global Connect series with Mark Mobius. He's the emerging market investment guru, as well as one of probably the key figure in emerging markets investment side, former executive chairman of Templeton, and he's now founding his own house, Mark Mobius Capital Partners, based in London. So stay tuned on the dates, details, but certainly we'll have it towards the second half of June, where we are bringing global trends, global insights by a leading thought leader to Indonesians back home, as well as those working overseas. But perhaps just before we all close off, allow me to congratulate Indonesia's government for the recent government bond issuance, one of the longest 50-year for an Asian government. So that's again to Wenya point around some of the confidence in the market on Indonesia's fiscal regime. Going forward, certainly Geepa will be supportive of looking and trying to maintain that type of confidence. And 2021 ahead, if Indonesia governments would like to tap, we certainly be very supportive of Indonesia government tapping into capital market in order to draw some of the bonds. In the UK, and some of my work in Accenture as the ASEAN Capital Market Director, we've been supporting a number of governments in tapping into London Stock Exchange to raise kind of the COVID-19 pandemic bonds. And there has been very positive reaction from institutional investors community, such as the 7 billion raised by the African Development Bank Group. These are the type of things where I think us professionals abroad could potentially support some of things that are for key priorities for Indonesia government, in particular the MOF side. There are a lot more to talk about, but cognizant we've already running out of time, I would like to close with thank you our speakers, Tom, Christy, Fabrio, Lord Desai, as well Wenya, to all be able to sacrifice a bit of your time on a weekend away from your family and share fantastic insights to the community of Indonesia professionals abroad. And thank you for everyone joining and tuning in from Indonesia as well. With that note, I will just quickly hand it back to Vijaya for quick logistics side. Vijaya?
Yep. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you all the participants, all the panelists for your extremely engaging insights. As per what Wenya said earlier, we will be sending a thank you note together with links to the recording of our webinar. And for more events, please stay connected at our social media at Shipa_ID for Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And thank you everyone for tuning in. Have a good rest of your weekend.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.